The history of America wasn't just written in ink on parchment. It was forged in fire, hammered onto iron rails, and fueled by the relentless pressure of white-hot steam. Long before the sky was filled with the roar of jet engines, the pulse of a nation was the rhythmic chugging of a locomotive. And that pulse began in the trembling hands of a man who spent his life fixing tiny watch springs. Philadelphia, January 1832. The air was a razor of frost, biting at the windows of a small workshop on Minor Street. Inside, Matthias Baldwin, a man whose reputation was built on the delicate precision of jewellery and the silent gears of clocks, stood mesmerised by a leak. A thin, ghost-like trail of steam was escaping from a hand-machined brass valve. To anyone else, it was a flaw. To Baldwin, it was a prophecy. You see, in 1831, America was a country of vast, untamed distances, held together by mud roads and slow-moving canal boats. The iron horse was still a fever dream imported from Great Britain. Baldwin had no degree in engineering. He had never stepped foot in a formal school of mechanics. But he possessed something far more dangerous: a jeweller's obsession with perfection. When the Philadelphia, Germantown and Norristown Railroad approached him with a desperate, almost suicidal request to build a working locomotive in just 6 months, they weren't looking for a titan. They were looking for a miracle. Baldwin took the gamble. He studied the imported English Robert Stephenson engines, memorizing the geometry of their boilers and the stroke of their pistons. On November 23, 1832, the miracle finally rolled out onto the tracks. They called it Old Ironsides. It was a 5-ton skeletal beast of wood and iron, breathing fire and exhaling soot. As the regulator opened, the wheels bit into the iron-strapped wooden rails. It didn't just move, it screamed. Travelling 6 miles in 58 minutes might seem trivial today, but in 1832 it was a rupture in the fabric of time. Baldwin had successfully harnessed 100 pounds per square inch of pressure to move human lives across the landscape at speeds that felt supernatural. He used anthracite coal, the black diamond of Pennsylvania, proving that the very earth beneath their feet could power the future. According to the deep archives of the Railroad Museum of Pennsylvania, Old Ironsides was temperamental, prone to breakdowns in the rain, and far from perfect. But it was real. It was proof of concept. And in that moment, the jeweller from Philadelphia stopped fixing watches and started building a nation. By 1840, the small workshop on Minor Street could no longer contain the ghost that Matthias Baldwin had conjured. The demand for steam was an addiction that America couldn't quit. Baldwin moved his operations to the Spring Garden district, carving out a sprawling industrial fortress that would eventually swallow nearly 200 acres of Philadelphia. This wasn't just a factory, it was a sovereign state of iron. By 1870, Baldwin Locomotive Works was the largest manufacturer of its kind in the Western Hemisphere, a titan that looked at the vastness of the American frontier and decided to conquer it with steel. To walk the floor of the Spring Garden complex in its prime was to witness a symphony of organized chaos. Imagine 20,000 men, a literal army of labor, working in a landscape that resembled a vision of Dante's Inferno. The air was a thick, choking soup of coal smoke, metallic dust, and the acrid stench of burnt sand. The heart of this beast was the foundry, where the temperature of the molten iron exceeded 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit. Here, men known as pourers moved with the precision of surgeons and the nerves of bomb squads, guiding tons of liquid fire into sand moulds that would become the massive driving wheels of a nation. But the true genius of Baldwin lay in the marriage of brute force and microscopic precision. Each locomotive was a puzzle of thousands of individual components: boilers, cylinders, fireboxes, and valve gears. Despite the deafening roar of steam-powered trip hammers that shook the very foundations of the city, the workers were required to machine parts to tolerances measured in the thousandths of an inch. A single hair-breadth error in a cylinder bore didn't just mean a leak. It meant a catastrophic failure on a mountain pass 2,000 miles away. This workforce was a living map of the old world. In the shadows of the assembly halls, you could hear the staccato rhythms of Polish, the melodic flow of Italian, and the harsh barks of German and Irish tongues. These were immigrants who had traded the fields of Europe for the 12-hour shifts of Philadelphia. They worked 6 days a week, the ears ringing with a relentless 110 decibel thunder that stole their hearing by middle age. They were paid in dollars, but they bought their lives with sweat and blood. By 1914, these 20,000 pairs of hands had hammered out over 35,000 locomotives, engines that didn't just carry cargo, they carried the hope, the greed, and the unstoppable ambition of the 19th century. April 1917. The world was bleeding. The Great War had become a static nightmare of trenches and barbed wire, and the key to breaking the stalemate wasn't just courage, it was logistics. When the United States finally entered the fray, the federal government didn't just ask for Baldwin's help. They seized the entire rail network under the United States Railroad Administration. Suddenly, the Spring Garden complex wasn't just a factory, it was the arsenal of democracy. The mission was simple but brutal: move 2 million men, their food, their medicine, and their mountains of heavy artillery across a continent. Baldwin was the only entity on Earth capable of such a feat. Since 1914, they had already been secretly forging steel for the Allies, but now the factory floor turned into a second front line. The workers were given a grim ultimatum. If a locomotive was delayed in Philadelphia, a battalion died in the mud of France. Between 1917 and 1918, the scale of production reached a fever pitch. Baldwin churned out over 5,500 military-grade locomotives. These weren't the polished, elegant engines of the Victorian era. They were Pershing engines, massive, grim, and painted in combat grey. They were designed to haul 90,000 tons of ammunition per day. Imagine the sight: giant cranes lifting these iron titans onto ships bound for the battle-scarred rail lines of the Meuse-Argonne. According to the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History, these Baldwin engines operated within range of German heavy guns. They ran on tracks that were often twisted by shellfire, through air, thick with mustard gas. During the 47-day Meuse-Argonne offensive, the supply chain survived only because the Baldwin machines refused to quit. They were the mechanical lungs of the American Expeditionary Forces. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, the world celebrated. But back in Philadelphia, the 20,000 workers didn't cheer for long. They simply wiped the grease from their foreheads and prepared for a peace that would prove even more dangerous than the war. The Roaring Twenties ended not with a bang, but with a sickening silence. When the stock market collapsed in 1929, the golden age of Baldwin didn't just stumble, it fell into an abyss. Demand for the iron giants vanished like smoke in a gale. The Spring Garden complex, once a hive of 20,000 screaming machines and sweating men, became an industrial graveyard. By 1939, the workforce had withered to a mere shadow of its former self. The assembly halls were cold, empty cathedrals of rusting steel.
Baldwin tried to pivot to diesel, but for a company whose soul was forged in the fire of a boiler, diesel felt like a betrayal. Then came Pearl Harbor. By January 1942, the War Production Board issued a decree that would change Philadelphia forever. Produce locomotives at maximum capacity. No excuses, no delays. But there was a problem. The men were gone. Millions had been drafted to fight across the Pacific and Europe. To fill the void, Baldwin did the unthinkable. They opened their gates to the women of Philadelphia. By 1943, nearly 30% of the workforce were women. These weren't Rosie the Riveters, just for the cameras. They were warriors of the lathe and the torch. Imagine the courage it took. These women, many of whom had never touched a tool heavier than a kitchen knife, were now welding massive boiler plates and assembling intricate valve systems. They worked 12-hour shifts, standing on oil-slicked floors, breathing in toxic fumes that made them vomit daily. According to records from the Pennsylvania Historical Commission, one woman recalled painting locomotive cabs while her husband was in a foxhole in Italy. She said, "I vomited twice a day for 6 months from the fumes, but I kept painting. My children needed to eat, and the soldiers needed those trains." The output was staggering. 12 locomotives per week. Every 7 days, a dozen new Titans rolled out of the factory. Among them was the legendary S-160 class, the general-purpose locomotive. It was a masterpiece of modular warfare, designed to be disassembled, crated like a toy, and reassembled in field workshops near the front lines. Over 2,100 of these 176,000-pound beasts were built. They carried 22 tons of coal and 6,000 gallons of water, enough to haul 1,500 tons of supplies across flat ground or 600 tons up a 2% grade. These numbers weren't just math. They were the difference between a successful invasion and a catastrophic retreat. In the heat of 1943, the hands of Philadelphia's women were literally building the road to Berlin.
August 1945. The world breathed a collective sigh of relief as the guns fell silent. But for Baldwin Locomotive Works, the peace was a death sentence. Almost overnight, the frantic pulse of the Spring Garden complex, the place that had built 12 Titans a week, flatlined. The massive wartime contracts were cancelled with a cold stroke of a pen. The 20,000 workers, the men who had spent decades in the heat and the women who had sacrificed their health for the front lines, were met with pink slips instead of medals. The tragedy of Baldwin wasn't that they couldn't build, it was that they loved the past too much. While competitors like General Motors were embracing the sleek, efficient hum of diesel-electric technology, Baldwin remained a prisoner of the steam age. They viewed diesel not as progress, but as a surrender. By 1950, the market shift was a tidal wave. Steam power, which had accounted for 95% of American rail in 1945, plummeted to just 30% in a single decade. Baldwin, a company that had spent 130 years perfecting the firebox and the boiler, simply couldn't pivot fast enough. The decline was a slow-motion catastrophe for Philadelphia. The workforce was cut in waves. First the young, then the veterans with 30 years of grease under their fingernails. They walked out of the gates, carrying their tools in silence, leaving behind a neighborhood that would soon collapse into economic ruin. In 1956, the final blow fell. Baldwin produced its last machine, locomotive number 70,000, a modest diesel switcher that felt like a whisper compared to the roar of old Ironsides. Shortly after, the Spring Garden complex, the industrial heart of a nation, was sold and demolished. Today the factory is gone, replaced by residential blocks and quiet streets. But the soul of Baldwin refuses to stay buried. scattered across 6 continents, from the mountain passes of the Rockies to the industrial corridors of developing nations. Those 70,000 machines still speak. Some sit in museums, their iron cold, while others, like the magnificent number 60,000 in Pennsylvania, still move, shaking the ground with a mechanical thunder that makes tourists weep. Baldwin's legacy isn't just about 70,000 engines. It's about the 840 million hours of human labour, 96,000 years of combined human life, poured into every rivet and every weld. It's the story of immigrants who found their voice in the roar of the foundry, and women who proved that steel has no gender. Baldwin Locomotive Works didn't survive the transition to the modern world, but the nation they built, the cities they connected, and the wars they won are the monuments that still stand. They built impossible things, one hammer blow at a time, until the work ran out. And that is why we remember.